Every year, as the chill of winter melts away and the first buds of spring begin to emerge, the world collectively shifts its gaze toward a familiar, vibrant celebration. Easter surrounds us, making its presence known in ways that are both deeply sacred and undeniably commercial. On one end of the spectrum, there are the grand, centuries-old cathedrals, echoing with the majestic sounds of pipe organs, and congregations singing triumphant hymns of resurrection. On the other end, there are the bustling aisles of modern grocery stores, lined with pastel-coloured candy, foil-wrapped chocolate bunnies, and wicker baskets brimming with brightly dyed eggs. It is a global phenomenon, a cultural and spiritual cornerstone that millions of people observe without a second thought. For the longest time, I simply accepted this duality, assuming that everything from the solemn sunrise services to the cheerful Sunday morning egg hunts was part of a seamless, ancient package handed down directly from the earliest days of faith. We naturally tend to believe that the religious traditions we grew up with are exact replicas of the past, preserved perfectly in amber. I still vividly recall the afternoon that comforting assumption was gently turned on its head. I was leafing through the thin, crinkling pages of an old Bible, genuinely seeking to connect the dots between the festive holiday I knew so well and the ancient history it claimed to represent. You grow up taking for granted that the bedrock of a faith, the very names of its most sacred holidays, must be explicitly etched into its foundational texts. Yet, as I looked closer, I experienced a quiet but profound moment of cognitive dissonance. I realised there is a vast, often unexamined landscape existing between the organised traditional religion we practice today and the raw, unpolished reality of the original texts. It was a fascinating discovery, not one that diminished the holiday's beauty, but rather one that sparked a deep, insatiable curiosity. It made me realise how much of what we consider timelessly sacred is actually a beautifully complex tapestry, intricately woven by human hands, shifting cultures, and changing languages over centuries. This brings us to a question that seems almost absurdly simple, yet holds a truly surprising revelation. If you were to sit down right now, open that ancient book, and meticulously read through every single chapter, from the cosmic beginnings of creation in Genesis all the way to the breathtaking, fiery visions of Revelation, would you actually find the word Easter written anywhere on those pages? We hold this day as the absolute pinnacle of the Christian calendar, the ultimate celebration of life conquering death, yet the very name we use to define it hides a secret in plain sight. The answer to whether Easter is truly in the Bible is far more complicated than a simple yes or no. And uncovering the truth takes us on an unexpected journey far beyond the church pews, drawing us deep into the heart of ancient history and linguistic mystery. To truly unravel this mystery, we have to cross a fascinating linguistic bridge. If you were to travel across most of the world during the spring and ask locals what they are celebrating, you would notice a striking pattern. In French, the holiday is called Pâques. In Italian, it is Pasqua. In Spanish, Pascua. And in Dutch, Pasen. I have always found it incredible how these words echo each other, all tracing their roots back to a single unifying source, the Greek word Pascha, which is itself a direct transliteration of the ancient Hebrew word Pesach, meaning Passover. This makes perfect, undeniable historical sense. The biblical narrative is intimately tied to this Jewish festival. The Last Supper, the crucifixion, and the resurrection all unfolded during the week of Passover. The early Christians, many of whom were Jewish, naturally saw the resurrection as the ultimate fulfillment of the Passover story. Yet, if the vast majority of the Christian world uses a word deeply rooted in biblical history, why on earth does the English-speaking world call it Easter? It feels like we are standing on a linguistic island, completely severed from the original context. To understand this disconnect, I realise we have to step far away from the sun-baked, dusty landscapes of first-century Jerusalem and travel into the cold, dense forests of ancient northern Europe. The puzzle pieces finally clicked into place for me when I read the accounts of the Venerable Bede, an 8th century English monk and historian. Bede documented that long before Christianity arrived, the Anglo-Saxons called the month of April Eostermonath. It was named after a local Germanic goddess of spring and the dawn, Eostre. After enduring long, brutal and dark winters, these ancient people held joyous festivals in her honour to celebrate the returning light and the warming earth. When Christian missionaries eventually reached these northern shores, they faced a choice. Rather than entirely erasing the local culture, they adapted. Because the timing of the resurrection perfectly coincided with the spring equinox, and the traditional festivals of Eostre, the two slowly merged. The geographic and cultural isolation of the British Isles meant that the Anglo-Saxon name stubbornly stuck. The holiday was entirely infused with new Christian theology, but the old pagan linguistic shell remained. It is a profound reminder of how our faith does not exist in a vacuum. It is shaped by the very dirt and geography of the people who adopt it. But knowing this history brings up an inevitable objection. You might be thinking, wait a minute, I know I've seen the word Easter in the Bible. If you grew up reading the classic, poetic King James Version, you are absolutely right, and I remember the exact moment I stumbled across it myself. In Acts 12:4 of the KJV, the text describes King Herod arresting the Apostle Peter, intending to bring him before the people after Easter. For generations, that single glaring verse served as the ultimate proof text, the smoking gun for the holiday's biblical legitimacy. However, as I dug deeper into the original Greek manuscripts, that illusion completely shattered. The actual Greek word written by the author Luke in that verse is Pascha, Passover. In every other instance throughout the entire New Testament, the King James translators correctly and accurately rendered Pascha as Passover. Yet, for some inexplicable reason, right there in the book of Acts, they chose to insert a medieval English cultural term. Modern biblical scholars universally recognise this as an anachronistic translation error. The early church in the book of Acts was not celebrating an English spring festival dedicated to a dawn goddess. They were observing the ancient Jewish Passover. Realising this was a humbling turning point for me. It showed me how easily, and often unintentionally, our cultural lenses can rewrite the very texts we hold sacred, projecting our modern traditions backward into a history where they simply did not exist. To truly grasp the profound reality of what we now casually call Easter, we have to completely strip away the pastel colours, the chocolate bunnies, and the modern debates over naming conventions, and allow ourselves to be transported thousands of years back in time to the dusty, sun-baked landscape of ancient Egypt. This is where the true foundational narrative begins, rooted deeply in an ancient event known as the Passover. For me, uncovering this specific historical layer has been the most breathtaking part of this entire journey, because it reveals that the resurrection was never meant to be viewed as a sudden, isolated theological event dropping unexpectedly from the sky, but rather as a story deeply anchored in the very soil of Jewish heritage. In the dramatic and sweeping narrative of the Old Testament, the Passover marks the monumental moment of liberation when the Israelites were freed from centuries of brutal slavery under the pharaohs. We often remember the story of the 10 devastating plagues, culminating in the terrifying final judgment, the death of the firstborn across the land. Yet, in the midst of this impending doom, a highly specific and unusual instruction was given for survival. Every Israelite family was told to take a young, unblemished lamb, sacrifice it, and brush its blood across the wooden doorposts of their homes. When the angel of death swept through Egypt that night, it would see the blood and literally pass over those marked houses, sparing the lives within. This powerful, visceral image of salvation through the blood of an innocent substitute was so deeply seared into the cultural and spiritual consciousness of the people that it became the defining heartbeat of their nation, celebrated faithfully year after year. If we fast forward a millennium and a half to first century Jerusalem, the historical backdrop remains exactly the same. When we read the Gospel accounts, Jesus and his closest disciples did not travel to the holy city to establish a brand new spring festival called Easter. They went there specifically to observe this ancient sacred Passover. The famous Last Supper, captured in countless paintings and revered in solemn church services, was an historical reality, a traditional Jewish Passover Seder. They were eating the bitter herbs, breaking the unleavened bread, and drinking the wine, actively remembering that ancient night of liberation in Egypt. But right there, in the intimate glow of that upper room, Jesus did something that shifted the axis of history. He took those ancient elements and radically reassigned their meaning to himself, declaring that the bread and wine now represented his own body and blood. This brings us face to face with one of the most powerful and heavily loaded titles in the entire biblical text, the Be'iyah Passover Lamb. I have spent a great deal of time quietly reflecting on why this specific metaphor was chosen, and the sheer architectural brilliance of it never fails to astound me. In the ancient sacrificial system, a lamb represented ultimate innocence, a pure substitute offered to atone for the brokenness of humanity. When John the Baptist first saw Jesus walking toward him at the Jordan River, he famously declared, "Behold the Lamb of God, who takes away the sin of the world." The alignment here goes far beyond mere poetic language. According to the historical timelines recorded in the Gospels, Jesus was hanging on a Roman cross, bleeding and suffocating. At the exact same time, the Passover lambs were being ritually slaughtered by the thousands in the nearby temple courts. The blood he shed on the wooden beams of the cross was seen by his early followers as the ultimate, eternal fulfillment of the blood smeared on the wooden doorposts in Egypt. While the original Passover lamb brought deliverance from physical chains, the Christian faith asserts that this final lamb brought deliverance from the spiritual chains of sin and death. When I look closely at the stunning synchronization of these events, I cannot help but be overwhelmed by the eerie, beautiful precision of the timing. There is a profound realization that washes over you when you see that there are absolutely no coincidences in the architecture of this faith. If we completely detach the story of the resurrection from the story of the Passover, we amputate the very heart of its meaning. The fact that Jesus was crucified and resurrected during this exact week is not some random historical accident. It is a flawless continuation, a brilliant horizontal thread stretching from the distant past right into the present. It is the climax of a story that had been meticulously told for centuries. This realization brings a strange grounding comfort, showing us a grand, overarching design where the ancient symbols of salvation are not discarded but beautifully transformed into a new, everlasting hope. So while the word Easter might be missing from the original texts, the DNA of the holiday is entirely biblical, serving as the glorious final chapter of a story that began long before the English language even existed. Gemini Jun Noi. Have you ever found yourself staring at a calendar in the early months of the year, trying to figure out exactly when Easter is going to land, and wondering why it cannot just pick a date and stick to it? It is a quirk of our modern schedule that we rarely question. Christmas is firmly anchored to December 25th, completely unwavering year after year. Yet Easter wanders restlessly across the spring months, bouncing anywhere from late March to late April. To understand the mechanics behind this shifting target, we have to step away from the biblical text itself and walk into the grand marble halls of the early Roman Empire, specifically the year 325 AD. In the first few centuries after the crucifixion, the early Christian movement was incredibly diverse, and quite frankly, a bit disorganised when it came to their calendar. As I delved into the history of the early church, I realised that believers were essentially split into two camps. Jewish Christians, particularly in Asia Minor, maintained their ancestral traditions and celebrated the resurrection exactly on the 14th day of the Jewish lunar month of Nisan, which was the exact date of the Passover sacrifice, regardless of what day of the week it happened to fall on. However, Gentile Christians in powerful, influential hubs like Rome and Alexandria firmly believed the resurrection must always be celebrated on a Sunday, the specific day the empty tomb was actually discovered. This created a jarring, disjointed reality across the empire, where one half of the Christian world might be fasting and mourning the crucifixion, while the other half was already joyously feasting and celebrating the resurrection. The tension eventually became untenable, threatening to fracture a faith that was just beginning to find its global footing and political power. This brings us to the historic Council of Nicaea, convened by the Roman Emperor Constantine. I have always found it profoundly fascinating that an assembly of hundreds of bishops gathered to debate the absolute deepest, most complex theological nature of God also had to sit down and solve what was essentially a massive administrative scheduling conflict. At Nicaea, the Church established a unified astronomical formula that we amazingly still use to this day. Easter would universally be celebrated on the first Sunday, following the first full moon that occurs on or after the vernal equinox. This intricate reliance on both the lunar cycle and the solar year is the exact reason why the holiday dances so unpredictably across our modern Gregorian calendars. But beneath this astronomical equation lies a much deeper, more consequential story of identity, theology, and separation. The decision at Nicaea was not merely a practical mathematical compromise, it was a deliberate, calculated pivot away from the roots of Judaism. The Church was rapidly transforming from a marginalised Jewish sect into the dominant state-sponsored religion of the Roman Empire, and its leaders felt an intense, undeniable need to establish a distinct, independent identity. Historical records and letters from the council reveal a strong, intentional desire to sever their administrative reliance on the Jewish calendar. Constantine himself famously argued that it was fundamentally unworthy for Christians to follow the calculations of the Jewish rabbis to determine the date of their most holy festival. This marked a monumental paradigm shift in religious history. By deliberately untethering the date of the resurrection from the 14th of Nisan, the Church actively shifted the theological focus away from the historical, earthly narrative of the Jewish Passover liberation and firmly recentered it on a broader, universal, and cosmic celebration of Christ's ultimate victory over death. When I reflect on this massive historical transition, it vividly reminds me of how heavily human fingerprints are pressed into the religious traditions we often consider purely divine. The way we celebrate this holiday today is the direct result of celestial mechanics, fierce theological debates, and ancient political manoeuvrings, all intricately woven together by early church leaders to preserve a sacred memory, even as they aggressively carved out a brand new path entirely their own. As we navigate the deep theological and historical currents of this holiday, we eventually have to confront the colourful, candy-coated elephant in the room. If you read the biblical accounts of the resurrection, you will find Roman soldiers, grieving women, angelic messengers, and an empty limestone tomb. But you will absolutely never find a single mention of a rabbit delivering baskets of brightly dyed eggs. Yet, if you walk into any store or neighbourhood during the spring, these are the undeniable, universal mascots of the season. How did we get from the solemn sacrifice of the Passover lamb to the cheerful, chocolate-covered Easter bunny? To understand this horizontal expansion of the holiday, we have to look at how a Middle Eastern faith collided with the folklore of Northern Europe. Long before Christianity swept across the continent, indigenous peoples celebrated the arrival of spring with intense joy. After surviving grueling dark winters, the sudden explosion of blooming flora and the rapid breeding of wildlife were seen as miraculous. Rabbits and hares, known for their prolific and rapid reproduction, naturally became ancient symbols of fertility and the unstoppable force of new life. Similarly, the egg has been revered across countless ancient cultures as a profound symbol of the universe and rebirth. When German immigrants first brought the legend of the Osterhase, an egg-laying hare, to the shores of America in the 1700s, it was just the latest chapter in a long history of cultural blending. What fascinates me most about this historical evolution is the brilliant, almost instinctual survival strategy of the early Christian church. When missionaries encountered these deeply entrenched pagan spring festivals, they did not simply try to aggressively eradicate them, knowing that humans naturally cling to their seasonal rhythms and comforting traditions. Instead, they employed a masterful tactic of cultural adaptation, essentially pouring the new wine of the Christian gospel into the old wineskins of local pagan customs. They effectively baptized these ancient symbols, stripping them of their original deity worship and infusing them with new theological meaning. The egg, for instance, underwent a brilliant rebranding. To the medieval Christian mind, an egg became the perfect metaphor for the resurrection. On the outside, it appears cold, hard, and completely lifeless, much like the stone tomb of Christ. Yet from within that hard shell, vibrant new life eventually breaks forth. Even the tradition of dyeing eggs red originally began among early Orthodox Christians to represent the bloodshed on the cross, a far cry from the neon pastels we use today. I often find myself quietly pondering whether this massive layer of cultural adaptation has been a help or a hindrance to the modern believer. It is incredibly easy to look at the commercialised circus of modern Easter and cynically conclude that the ancient sacred core of the holiday has been completely swallowed whole by pagan folklore and corporate greed. I have certainly had my moments of wondering if these cute, fluffy symbols dangerously obscure the gritty, awe-inspiring reality of the historical resurrection. But the more I sit with it, the more I realise that human beings are deeply tactile creatures. We struggle to fully grasp abstract, cosmic, spiritual concepts like eternal life, atonement, and resurrection without something physical to hold on to. Perhaps these symbols, as historically detached from the Bible as they might be, are not necessarily enemies of the truth, but rather accessible visual aids. They serve as a gentle, universal language of renewal, whispering the same fundamental promise that the earth itself preaches every single spring. That light eventually conquers darkness, that warmth overcomes the bitter cold, and that out of the cold, hard ground of death, an abundant, vibrant new life will always find a way to break through. Gemini Janoi, after peeling back the layers of linguistic misunderstandings, ancient calendar disputes, and centuries of cultural assimilation, we are left with a beautifully raw and unavoidable truth. The word Easter, in its literal Anglo-Saxon form, is unequivocally absent from the pages of the Bible. But to stop there, to treat this as merely a clever moment of historical trivia, would be to completely miss the forest for the trees. Because while the specific name might be a product of European history, the singular event it points to, the resurrection, is the absolute undeniable backbone of the entire New Testament. If you were to surgically remove the concept of the physical resurrection from the biblical text, the whole narrative structure of Christianity would instantly collapse in on itself. The Apostle Paul himself wrote with striking candour that if Christ has not been raised, the entire faith is entirely useless, and its followers are to be pitied above all men. The early disciples did not willingly face brutal persecution and martyrdom for a metaphorical spring festival or a cleverly invented myth. They were radically, permanently transformed by their absolute conviction that they had literally witnessed a man conquer the grave. As I have wrestled with all of this, the intertwined traditions, the quirky translations, and the deeply layered origins, I have come to a quiet, grounding realization. It is so incredibly easy to get tangled up in the theological weeds, endlessly debating which cultural symbols are appropriate, arguing over terminology, or stressing about exactly what day we should circle on the calendar. But focusing solely on the historical and linguistic mechanics can cause us to lose sight of the profound, beating heart of the message. The resurrection is not meant to be merely a static historical event, frozen in time and analysed under an academic microscope. It is designed to be an active, ongoing spiritual experience of profound personal renewal. It is the ultimate promise that no matter how dark the Friday is, Sunday is always coming. It speaks directly to the deepest human ache for transformation, offering the radical assurance that our own failures, griefs, and metaphorical deaths are not the end of the story. Whether you call it Easter, Pascha, Resurrection Sunday, or simply the arrival of spring, the core invitation remains exactly the same. An invitation to step out of the dark, suffocating tombs of our past and walk boldly into the brilliant, warming light of a completely new life. So after travelling through centuries of linguistic shifts, ancient councils, and the curious blending of folklore with faith, we finally arrive at our answer. Is Easter in the Bible? The honest, nuanced answer is both no and yes. It is a resounding no if we are searching for the specific English word, the spring-themed name, or the rabbits and eggs we've come to associate with the season. Those are the beautiful, messy, and human layers of culture that have been draped over the story like a colourful tapestry over many generations. But it is a definitive, earth-shaking yes when we look at the essence, the soul, and the historical reality of the resurrection itself. My hope is that this journey hasn't just been a dive into trivia, but a gentle reminder, a look beneath the surface. It's easy to get caught up in the outward forms, the specific names we use, or the traditions we've inherited. But the real power lies in the truth those forms are trying to point toward. I've realised that while we might celebrate with different symbols and under different names, the underlying invitation to witness life overcoming death remains unchanged. As you move forward, I encourage you to cherish the truth more than the tradition, and to seek the profound living heart that beats beneath the external shells of language and history. After all, the most important part of any story isn't the name on the cover, but the transformation it works within us.